In an empire where the king's command was as unchangeable as life and death itself, a terrifying decree thundered: all Jews were to be exterminated. The destiny of an entire nation seemed sealed, until one unlikely young woman dared to challenge the impossible. Stay until the very end and discover how the courage of a woman not only altered the fate of her people, but also carries a message powerful enough to transform your life today. Esther, an orphaned Jewess turned queen, carried a secret no one could have imagined. She lived among banquets, crowns, and palaces, yet every step she took carried the risk of exposure. When the decree of death was signed, she knew either remain silent and watch her people perish, or rise and risk her very life. What would you do in her place? Then came Mordecai's timeless words: "Who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" That question was not only for Esther. It's for us, too. Have you ever considered that there may be a moment in your life when your decision could change not just your own destiny, but the destiny of many others? Esther made the boldest choice of her life. She fasted, she prayed, and she declared, "If I perish, I perish." It was a leap into the unknown, an act of faith that could cost her both her crown and her life. But the story does not end there. What happened next shook the empire. Hidden plots were revealed, a cruel enemy was unmasked, and an entire nation experienced deliverance. And what no one expected is that this story is not only about the past. It carries an urgent message for our time. Don't miss a single detail, because every scene of this story holds a powerful secret for us today. Hello, it's such a joy to have you here again. Today, we are diving into one of the most dramatic and inspiring stories in the Bible: the courage of Esther. Get ready, because we're not just talking about a queen with extraordinary beauty, but about a woman who risked everything: her position, her wealth, even her own life, to fulfill God's purpose in her time. When we think of courage, we often picture armed heroes, mighty warriors, or powerful leaders. But Esther's courage did not lie in weapons or armies. It was rooted in something far deeper: absolute trust in God, even when standing face to face with death. And that makes her story even more relevant to us today. How many times do we face situations where fear overwhelms us, where it seems there's no way out, where a single decision could change everything? Esther shows us that true power doesn't lie in those who seem to hold control, but in those who place their trust in the Lord. In this journey, you will discover details you may never have noticed before. You will see how a decree of death turned into a festival of victory. How an orphaned young woman became God's chosen instrument to save a nation. And how this same God continues to raise people up for decisive moments, including you. So, before we begin, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button and share this video. That way, this message of faith can reach many more lives around the world. And tell me in the comments, which city and country are you watching from? I would love to know how far this message of courage and hope is reaching. Now, take a deep breath, because what comes next will surprise you. The setting was the Persian Empire at the height of its glory. King Ahasuerus, known for his wealth and ostentation, had prepared a banquet that lasted 180 days. Picture the scene. Lavish tables filled with food, overflowing wine, rich tapestries, marble columns, and gold everywhere. It was his way of showing the world that no one surpassed his power. Can you imagine such a display of luxury? Yet behind all that grandeur lay a hidden emptiness. The king's heart, though surrounded by riches, was not satisfied. And that emptiness soon erupted in a decision that would change history. During one of the feasts, the king, drunk with wine and pride, commanded Queen Vashti to appear before his guests to display her beauty. To him, it seemed a simple whim, but in reality, he was treating her as an object. Vashti refused to obey. That single no triggered a crisis. The king's pride was wounded in front of all, and in his fury, encouraged by rash advisers, he deposed Vashti from the throne. Here's something to reflect on. How many times do decisions made in haste, under the influence of pride or fleeting emotions, open doors to unexpected consequences? The king had no idea that his command would create space for a new queen to be chosen, and that this new figure would be central to God's plan. Esther had not yet entered the scene, but we already see the hand of the Lord moving behind the curtains. Do you believe God also guides the details of your life, even when situations seem chaotic and senseless? Years later, the king's heart still felt empty. Vashti no longer sat on the throne, and his counselors suggested seeking the most beautiful young women of the empire to choose a new queen. That was when Esther, a Jewish orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, entered the story. Think about it. Of all the young women in the empire, how could a simple girl, with no wealth or influence, possibly be chosen? Here we learn that God does not depend on human circumstances to fulfill His plans. Maybe you have felt small, invisible, or without chances in a world that values status and appearance. But if God has a purpose for you, He can place you in places you never imagined. That Esther was brought into the palace. The process was rigorous, lasting months of preparation. It wasn't only about beauty, but also grace, wisdom, and a spirit that stood apart. And among all the candidates, Esther found favor in the eyes of the officials and of the king himself. She was crowned queen, Have you ever wondered why God allows certain unexpected changes in your life? Sometimes, when doors close, or when it seems like someone else has taken the place we wanted, in reality, God may be preparing space for something greater. That's what happened with Esther. Vashti's fall opened the way for a young, unlikely girl to become the most influential woman in the empire, and no one knew that this choice wasn't only about beauty or charm. It was divine intervention to save an entire people, the people of God. Here's a reflection for you. Could it be that what seems like coincidence in your life is actually part of a bigger plan? Could it be that the place you occupy right now, in your work, in your family, in your ministry, is precisely where God wants to use you for such a time as this? Meanwhile, Mordecai, faithful servant of God, continued to guide Esther in secret. He instructed her not to reveal her Jewish identity. Time would prove how crucial this advice was. See how the story builds: a banquet, a king's mistake, a queen's fall, and the rise of an unlikely young woman. They seem like isolated events, but they're not. Viewed from God's perspective, every detail is interconnected, and so begins Esther's journey. The queen, who did not seek a throne, but was led to it by God's eternal purpose. And maybe that is a direct message for you today. It is not about seeking greatness for yourself, but about being available for the Lord to use you. What Esther didn't yet know was that her position in the palace would be tested in a way that would put at stake not only her life, but the survival of her entire people. And what followed her coronation would be more intense than any royal banquet could display, even as Esther adjusted to life as queen. In the shadows, an enemy was rising, one whose ambition and hatred would threaten to wipe out an entire nation. While the palace rejoiced over the new queen, a shadow quietly rose. King Ahasuerus had promoted Haman, an ambitious man, to the highest rank among his princes. Arrogant and self-absorbed, Haman demanded that everyone bow before him. To most, it was a mere formality. But one man would not bow: Mordecai, the Jew. Picture it: every official bending the knee to Haman. And there stood Mordecai, upright, unshaken, fearless. Have you ever faced a moment where everyone else went along with something wrong, but you knew you could not compromise? The courage to remain faithful, even alone, often provokes hatred from the proud. Haman, burning with fury, refused to punish only Mordecai. That would not satisfy him. Instead, his heart filled with deadly hatred. Upon learning that Mordecai was a Jew, he resolved to exterminate not just one man, but the entire people. See how human pride can morph into cruelty without limits. Haman, cunning and persuasive, approached the king with carefully crafted words. He claimed there was a people scattered throughout the empire, living by their own laws, not following the king's decrees, a threat to the kingdom's unity. Without deeper reflection, the king gave Haman authority to write a decree, and thus a death sentence was sealed against all Jews. Think of it, with one stroke of the pen. Countless innocent lives were condemned. Have you ever felt the injustice of seeing decisions made without truth being considered? The signed decree was like a dark cloud hanging over millions of people. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, crying loudly. His grief was not only personal, it was the cry of a man carrying the weight of his people. Esther, secluded in the palace, had no knowledge of what was happening. But when her servants and eunuchs told her about Mordecai's condition, she sent clothes for him to wear. He refused. It wasn't about appearances. It was about an urgent call. He sent a clear message. Esther had to act. Here is a crucial lesson. Sometimes we live in comfort, sheltered from the pain others are enduring. But God calls us to open our eyes. Could it be that you too have ignored the cries around you simply because they haven't reached your doorstep yet? Mordecai sent Esther a copy of the decree and asked her to intercede with the king. It was an impossible request. Esther knew the risk. In the Persian court, no one could approach the king without being summoned, not even the queen. The law was clear. Anyone who dared enter uninvited would be put to death unless the king extended his golden scepter. Esther replied to Mordecai with fear. Who wouldn't be afraid of such a fate? But Mordecai pressed firmly. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone will escape. Who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Those words still echo today. Have you considered that maybe you are exactly where you are, in your family, in your workplace, in your community, because God has a specific purpose for you? Perhaps it is no accident that you are hearing this story right now. Esther understood. The fear didn't vanish, but faith outweighed it. She made the most important decision of her life. She called for a 3-day fast and prayer throughout the community. Then she declared her immortal phrase, "If I perish, I perish." See how true courage is born, not from the absence of fear, but from trust in God that is greater than any threat. Here's a question for you to ponder. In the struggles you face, are you hiding or are you seeking God through prayer and fasting? As the empire braced for massacre, Esther prepared in silence before God. The palace didn't know, but in just a few days, a queen would risk her life for a cause greater than herself. And as she readied herself for the throne room, the fate of an entire people was about to hinge on one decisive step forward. The 3 days of fasting and prayer felt like an eternity. While the Jewish people cried out to God, Esther prepared for the decisive moment. There were no guarantees of victory, no way to predict the king's reaction. But there was one certainty: her life no longer belonged to herself. With every breath, Esther renewed her faith, whispering in her heart, "If I perish, I perish." On the third day, Esther, dressed in her royal garments, picture the scene, her heart racing as she walked slowly through the palace corridors. Every step was an act of courage. The heavy silence of the marble halls seemed to ask, will the king accept her presence or order her death? She entered. Before her stood the throne of King Ahasuerus, surrounded by guards and nobles. No one dared interrupt. The king lifted his eyes and saw her. His gaze could mean life or death. What would you have done in her place? And then the unexpected happened. The king extended the golden scepter toward the queen. Relief flooded Esther's heart. God was with her. The impossible had just taken place. How many times have we too faced closed doors, only to see them open by the grace of God? With humility, Esther approached, touched the scepter, and heard the king say, "What is your request, Queen Esther?" "Even up to half the kingdom, it shall be granted to you." What an extraordinary offer! Yet Esther did not rush. Instead of revealing her request immediately, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. What wisdom! Esther wasn't only speaking to the king's heart. She was being guided by God. At the first banquet, the king repeated his question, "What is your petition?" Once again, Esther surprised him, asking only that the king and Haman return for a second banquet the following day. It was a moment of waiting, of preparation. Sometimes God teaches us to trust even when we want immediate answers. Meanwhile, Haman left the banquet swollen with pride. To be the only guest of the queen seemed proof of his greatness. But as he passed the palace gate, there stood Mordecai upright, refusing to bow. Haman's hatred boiled. Fueled by rage, he ordered a gallows nearly 75 feet high to be built, intending to hang Mordecai the very next day. Pride had blinded him, leading him toward his own ruin. That same night, something extraordinary happened. The king could not sleep. He ordered the chronicles of the kingdom to be read to him. Coincidence? No, divine providence. Of all the records, the one chosen was the account of how Mordecai had uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. And the detail: Mordecai had never been rewarded. Do you see how God moves pieces perfectly? While Haman plotted Mordecai's death, the king was reminded of Mordecai's loyalty. You may think your faithfulness goes unnoticed, but before God, nothing is forgotten. The next morning, as Haman entered the palace to request Mordecai's execution, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Thinking the king spoke of him, Haman described a grand display: royal robes, the king's horse, and public honor. To his shock, the king commanded, "Do everything just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew." Picture it. The man who planned Mordecai's death now led him through the streets in triumph. Do you believe God still turns humiliation into unexpected victory? Haman returned home humiliated, but the second banquet approached. There, the king once again asked Esther, "What is your request?" Silence filled the room. The moment had come. Her heart pounded, taking a deep breath. She spoke, "If I have found favor with you, O king, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For we have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." The king was stunned. Who is he, and where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther, firm and courageous, pointed. The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. The room erupted in chaos. The king, furious, stormed out into the garden. Haman, desperate, fell at Esther's feet, begging for his life. But the sentence was sealed that very day. Haman was hanged on the gallows he had built for Mordecai. It seemed like the story had reached its climax, but it hadn't. The decree of death was still active across the empire. The people still awaited the day marked for their destruction. How could a nation survive a law that even the king could not revoke? The death of Haman brought immediate relief, but not final victory. The enemy was gone, but his words still echoed throughout the empire. The decree authorizing the extermination of the Jews had been sealed with the king's signet ring, and, under the laws of the Medes and Persians, it could not be revoked. Imagine the tension. The threat still hung over millions, and the days were counting down. Mordecai now held the position once belonging to Haman. The royal signet ring was on his hand. Yet the problem remained like an unmovable wall. What was written be undone. Have you ever faced a moment when, even after a victory, it seemed the battle was far from over? Once again, Esther appeared before the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading for her people's lives. Picture this: the queen, in all her dignity, humbling herself, not for her own sake, but for her nation. The king extended the golden scepter again, granting her an audience. He listened. But there was a problem. The law could not be cancelled. So the king gave Esther and Mordecai a solution: write another decree. They could not erase the old one, but they could issue a new order allowing the Jews to defend themselves on the appointed day. The impossible was turning into the possible. Letters were written in the king's name, translated into every language of the empire, and sent swiftly by mounted couriers. The new decree declared that the Jews could unite and fight for their lives when attacked. Fear that once paralyzed them now turned into hope. Across villages, towns, and provinces, the news spread like wildfire. Many Gentiles, witnessing God's providence, even chose to identify with the Jews. The impossible was unfolding before their eyes. Here is something important to reflect on. God doesn't always remove the problem, but He gives us strength to face it. The first decree wasn't erased, but a new path opened. How often have you wished a situation would simply vanish, when in reality God was giving you courage and resources to walk through it? The day finally arrived. The empire waited to see Jews fall. But instead of defeat, they witnessed a people united, full of faith, standing to defend their lives. In every province, their enemies were overcome. Even officials of the kingdom supported the Jews out of respect for Mordecai. Esther and Mordecai had become instruments in God's hands to turn death into deliverance. What began with fasting, tears, and fear ended with celebration. The people established the Feast of Purim as a memorial of their salvation. To this day, it is remembered as evidence that God never abandons His people. But don't miss this. The story is not only about a nation saved long ago. It points to a future time when unjust decrees will rise again, when God's people will face pressure and persecution. Just as Esther was called for such a time as this, so too will God's people be called to stand firm in days of crisis. And in your own life, perhaps you already know moments when courage was demanded of you. Maybe in your family, in your workplace, in your faith journey, you faced choices where silence was tempting, but standing firm was necessary. Esther's life reminds us it doesn't matter how great the risk. What matters is in whom we place our trust. As the empire celebrated, one question lingered. If God could turn an unbreakable human law into victory, what more can He do for those who place their lives in His hands? The Feast of Purim was established as a living memorial of the deliverance God had given His people. But before the celebration was instituted, Esther's heart still carried the marks of the battles she had faced. Every detail of the story revealed that she had not been chosen by chance. It was evident God had placed her on the throne for that exact moment in history. Think about it. Esther was just a young orphan, with no influence, no political connections, no wealth. Who could have imagined that such a girl would become queen of an empire and the instrument to save millions of lives? That is how God works. He takes the unlikely, the small in the eyes of the world, and places them in strategic positions to accomplish great purposes. Do you believe He can do the same in your life? The Jews, once condemned to silence and death, now celebrated victory. Their homes were filled with joy, and their streets echoed with songs of gratitude. The day that was set aside for mourning turned into a festival. What seemed impossible became an eternal testimony that, when God decides to act, nothing can stop his hand. Esther knew her position as queen was not a personal privilege, but a divine calling. Her life teaches us that our gifts, opportunities, and even the places we occupy are not meant for our benefit alone, but so we can serve and honor God. Here's a powerful reflection. Have you thought that what you have and where you are may not be coincidence, but preparation for something greater? Mordecai, once seated at the palace gate, was now second in command of the empire, respected by all. His name was written into history as a symbol of loyalty and courage. He refused to bow before the enemy, and that choice changed everything. Sometimes courage is not in grand gestures, but in small acts of faithfulness, repeated day after day as the people rejoiced. The deepest message of the story was clear. The true hero was not Esther, nor Mordecai, but the God who orchestrated every detail. From Vashti's removal to the king's sleepless night, everything was part of a greater plan. Have you realized how even the simplest details of your life can be used by God for something extraordinary? And here lies the most inspiring truth. Mordecai's words to Esther continue to echo today. Who knows if you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? It is not just a memory of the past. It is a call for the present. Each of us has a moment, an opportunity, a place where God calls us to make a difference. Perhaps you are facing challenges in your family, in your work, or in your faith. Perhaps you feel the pressure is too great, the fear too strong. But remember, courage is not the absence of fear. Esther was afraid, yet she trusted. She fasted, prayed, and surrendered. Courage is choosing to trust God even when the outcome is uncertain. Even when the future looks dark. Esther did not know if she would live when she stepped into the king's court. But she knew in whom she trusted. And you may not have all the answers to your struggles today, but if you place your life in God's hands, He will open paths where none seem to exist. This story ends with feasting, with victory, and with God's name exalted. But it also leaves us with a question. If Esther had remained silent, what would have happened? How many lives would have been lost? How many stories would never have been told? And what about you? If you remain silent in the moments when God calls you to act, who might be left without blessing? Silence may feel safe, but courage to speak, to act, to stand firm, that is what changes destinies. The Jews celebrated Purim year after year, remembering how God turned mourning into joy, fear into victory, and silence into courage. And that celebration still echoes today as testimony that the Lord never abandons his people as the empire rejoiced. One truth remained: the God who raised Esther for her time continues to raise people today, in every generation, for decisive moments. Who knows if you, too, have been placed where you are for such a time as this? The story of Esther reminds us that there are no coincidences in God's plan. What seemed like chance, a queen deposed, a young girl chosen among many, a king unable to sleep at night, all were pieces of a greater purpose. The unseen thread of divine providence stitched every detail until an orphan girl became the voice of a nation. And that makes us reflect: what about us? Could it be that we too are being quietly prepared for decisive moments? Perhaps you look at your life and think you have no influence, that your voice is small, that your choices don't matter. But Esther's courage shows us that when we trust in God, even the smallest steps can echo in eternity. Courage is not the absence of fear. Esther felt fear, but she refused to be ruled by it. She fasted, she prayed, she surrendered. Courage is choosing to trust God when circumstances are against you, when the future looks uncertain. It is standing up and saying, "If I perish, I perish," knowing that a life placed in God's hands is never wasted. And if this story touched your heart, let me ask, could it be that God is also calling you for such a time as this? Maybe it's in your family, maybe in your workplace, maybe in your faith journey. A moment when silence is easy, but standing firm is necessary. If this message spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs courage to face life's battles. And tell me in the comments, which part of Esther's story touched you most? And from which city and country are you watching? I would love to see how far this message of faith and hope is reaching. May the same courage that sustained Esther fill your heart too. And when your decisive moment comes, may you remember you are not alone. The God who raised Esther is alive and ready to act through you.